Hello, dear history travelers, and welcome back to another journey into the hidden corridors of power. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend your time here with me today as we explore one of medieval Europe's most troubling patterns: how kingdoms placed crowns on the heads of children and the powerful men who controlled those children like puppets. Before we begin uncovering these stories of innocence exploited and childhood stolen by politics, I want to ask for your support. If you enjoy these deep explorations into the darker corners of royal history, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these carefully researched, thought-provoking stories to light. Also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me which aspect of medieval childhood and power dynamics you'd like us to explore next. Every comment is read and helps shape our content. Now, settle into a comfortable space and prepare to witness how medieval Europe repeatedly placed impossible burdens on the smallest shoulders, creating tragedies that shaped nations and destroyed lives. Let's discover the child kings of Europe and the men who used them. Imagine being 6 years old. At that age, most children are learning to read, playing with toys, discovering the world under their parents' protection. You might be starting school, making friends, testing boundaries in safe environments designed for children. Now imagine that at 6 years old, you're told you're the king of England and France. You're told that millions of people depend on you. You're told that armies fight in your name, that nobles bow before you, that your every word is law. You're told all of this, and you're too young to understand what any of it means. This was the reality for Henry VI of England, crowned King of England at 9 months old and King of France at his father's death when he was just under a year old. He grew up surrounded by men fighting for control of his person, his seal, his authority. Control of him was control of 2 kingdoms. By the time he was old enough to actually try to rule, England had been governed by competing regents and councils for his entire childhood. He'd been used as a symbol, a tool, a prize to be captured and controlled. He'd never learned to be a king because he'd spent his entire life being someone else's puppet. Henry VI's story ended in madness, civil war, and murder, but he wasn't alone. Throughout medieval Europe, child kings inherited thrones with disturbing regularity. Sometimes the child was an infant, sometimes a toddler, sometimes old enough to understand what was happening but too young to control it. And surrounding each child king was a swarm of powerful men: uncles, cousins, nobles, bishops, military commanders, all claiming to act in the child's best interest, while actually pursuing their own power, wealth, and ambitions. These men would say they were protecting the young king, guiding him until he came of age, serving the kingdom by providing experienced leadership. But the reality was often darker: manipulation, exploitation, imprisonment disguised as protection, decisions made in the child's name that benefited everyone except the child. Some child kings survived to adulthood and even became effective rulers, though often scarred by childhoods spent as political pawns. Others never escaped the control of their handlers, becoming permanent figureheads for other men's ambitions. Others died young, murdered, poisoned, or conveniently falling ill when they became more valuable dead than alive. Today, we're going to explore the world of medieval child kings. We'll meet Henry VI of England, who inherited 2 kingdoms as an infant and lost both, his childhood stolen by regents who couldn't agree, and his adulthood plagued by the consequences of decisions made when he was too young to understand. Louis IX of France, who became king at 12 and was controlled by his formidable mother Blanche of Castile, who ruled France in his name and shaped him into the saint king he became, but at what cost to his own development. Richard II of England, who became king at 10 after his grandfather's death, watched his kingdom torn by rebellion, was manipulated by advisors, and eventually deposed by his own cousin. Edward VI of England, who inherited his father Henry VIII's throne at 9, was pulled between Protestant and Catholic factions and died at 15, possibly murdered to prevent him from changing religious policy. Ivan the Terrible, who became Grand Prince of Moscow at 3, suffered through a childhood of neglect, manipulation, and violence that shaped him into one of history's most brutal rulers. We'll explore the patterns, how regencies were established, how power struggles played out, how child kings were used as pawns in adult games of power. We'll see how some children grew up to take real control, how others remained puppets their entire lives, and how still others didn't survive to adulthood. We'll meet the men who controlled them, some genuinely trying to serve the kingdom, some nakedly pursuing power, most somewhere in between. We'll see how these men justified controlling children, how they fought each other for that control, and what happened when child kings finally tried to assert their own authority. These are stories about the vulnerability of children in systems designed for adults, about power divorced from competence, about the tragedy of placing crowns on heads too young to understand their weight. They're stories that reveal the dark side of hereditary monarchy, that bloodline alone determined fitness to rule, regardless of age, capacity, or readiness. Prepare yourself for a journey into throne rooms where the most powerful person in the kingdom couldn't tie his own shoes, where decisions of war and peace were made by men speaking in a child's name, where innocence was a political liability and childhood a period to be endured and survived rather than protected and cherished. The child kings of Europe and the men who used them, this is their story. Let us begin with perhaps the most tragic child king in English history, Henry VI, who inherited the crowns of England and France before he could walk and spent his entire life struggling with the consequences of having been thrust into power far too young. Henry VI was born on December 6, 1421, at Windsor Castle. His father was Henry V, the warrior king who had conquered much of France and forced the French king to recognize him as heir to the French throne. His mother was Catherine of Valois, a French princess. Henry VI was born into ultimate privilege and expectation. He was to unite the crowns of England and France, creating the greatest kingdom in Christendom. But on August 31, 1422, when Henry was just 9 months old, his father died suddenly of dysentery in France. The infant became King Henry VI of England. 2 months later, Charles VI of France died. By the terms of the Treaty of Troyes, which Henry V had forced on France, the French crown now passed not to Charles's son, the Dauphin Charles, but to his grandson, the infant Henry VI of England. At less than a year old, Henry VI was formally king of both England and France. This was unprecedented. Never before had such vast territories been united under a single crown, and never before had that crown rested on such a tiny head. The immediate problem was obvious: a baby cannot rule. Medieval monarchy required the king to make decisions, issue orders, lead armies, dispense justice, manage nobles. An infant can do none of these things. The solution was a regency, a council of senior nobles and relatives who would govern in the king's name until he came of age. But this created its own problems. Who would control the regency? And controlling the regency meant effectively ruling 2 kingdoms.
Henry V had attempted to arrange matters before his death. He designated his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of England, and his other brother, John, Duke of Bedford, as regent of France. But Henry V's arrangements were incomplete and ambiguous, creating space for conflict. The Regency Council that actually formed in England was a compromise that satisfied no one. Gloucester was named protector, but his powers were limited. Bedford had authority in France, but had to coordinate with England. Beaufort, Bishop, later Cardinal Winchester, wealthy and ambitious, competed with Gloucester for influence. Other nobles jockeyed for position. From infancy, Henry was the center of power struggles he couldn't comprehend. Different factions claimed to speak for him, to represent his interests, to govern in his name, but none of them were primarily concerned with what was best for the child himself. What was Henry's childhood actually like? We have some glimpses from records. He was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on November 6, 1429, when he was 7 years old. The ceremony was elaborate, following ancient tradition. Henry had to sit still through hours of ritual, wearing a crown too heavy for his small head, surrounded by adults performing ceremonies he didn't understand. 2 years later, he was taken to France and crowned King of France at Notre Dame in Paris on December 16, 1431, at age 10. This was a propaganda move to demonstrate that the English claim to France was real, not just theoretical. But for Henry, it was another exhausting ceremony in a foreign country, performed in a language he was still learning. Between these coronations, Henry lived at various royal residences, educated by tutors, surrounded by servants, and carefully monitored by Regency officials. His daily life was regimented, ritualized, shaped by the needs of kingship rather than the needs of childhood. He studied Latin, French, and English. He learned theology. He was deeply religious from a young age. He learned the forms of kingship, how to hold audiences, how to preside over councils. But he didn't learn how to actually wield power, because every decision was made by someone else.
As Henry grew, the power struggles around him intensified. Let's meet the key players who shaped his childhood. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, Henry's uncle, who styled himself as Protector and Good Duke Humphrey. He was learned, cultured, and intensely ambitious. He wanted to control his nephew and through him England's government. He feuded constantly with Cardinal Beaufort. John, Duke of Bedford, Henry's other uncle, who spent most of his time in France trying to preserve English conquests. Bedford was the most capable of Henry's guardians, genuinely concerned with governance. His death in 1435 removed the stabilizing influence on the regency. Henry Beaufort, Cardinal Winchester, enormously wealthy, politically astute, and devoted to his own advancement. He and Gloucester were bitter rivals, their conflict dominating English politics during Henry's minority. Richard, Duke of York, as Henry grew older, York emerged as a powerful figure with his own claim to the throne through the Mortimer line. York represented an alternative to Henry's rule, though he didn't openly claim the crown during Henry's childhood. These men and others fought over policy, positions, and patronage, all ostensibly for Henry's benefit, all actually for their own advantage. Young Henry watched grown men, his relatives and supposed protectors, argue, scheme, and sometimes come to blows over how to govern for him. This childhood of ritual without power, authority without autonomy, shaped Henry profoundly. By the time he was declared of age to rule personally, around 1617, patterns were set. Passivity. Henry had learned that others made decisions. He'd spent his entire life being told what to do, where to go, what to say.
Developing initiative or assertiveness was nearly impossible in that environment. Piety over politics. Henry found refuge in religion, prayer, study of scripture, founding religious institutions. These were areas where he could exercise some autonomy. He became intensely devout, but his piety was partly a retreat from the political demands he couldn't meet. Lack of political judgment. Henry had never learned to assess people's motives or navigate political conflicts because he'd never been allowed to. When he finally tried to rule personally, he was easily manipulated by advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. Preference for peace. Having grown up watching adults fight over his person and authority, Henry developed an aversion to conflict. This made him unsuited for medieval kingship, which often required decisive military action. Inability to assert authority. The one thing kings needed, the ability to command and be obeyed, Henry never developed. He'd been commanded his entire childhood. He didn't know how to reverse the dynamic. One of the great tragedies of Henry's reign was the loss of France, precisely what his childhood regency was supposedly preventing. The Dauphin Charles, who became Charles VII, never accepted English rule. With the help of Joan of Arc and the renewed French national spirit she inspired, Charles began reconquering French territories in the 1430s. The English regency couldn't respond effectively. Gloucester and Beaufort were too busy fighting each other. Resources were divided between maintaining control in France and managing English politics. Bedford's death in 1435 removed effective military leadership. By the time Henry was ruling personally, the situation in France was collapsing. English holdings that Henry V had conquered were being systematically recaptured. Henry, personally committed to peace and lacking military ability, couldn't reverse the tide. By 1453, England had lost everything in France except Calais. The dual monarchy of Henry's infancy, England and France united, had disintegrated. The great achievement of Henry V, which Henry Infant had inherited, was gone, and Henry was blamed.
In 1453, Henry suffered a mental breakdown. For over a year, he was completely catatonic, unable to speak, unresponsive, essentially absent mentally. We don't know the exact cause, but the stress of kingship on someone utterly unprepared for it likely contributed. During Henry's incapacity, Richard, Duke of York, was named protector. When Henry recovered in 1455, York was reluctant to give up power. This sparked the Wars of the Roses, a civil war that would ravage England for 3 decades. Henry was deposed, restored, deposed again. He spent years imprisoned in the Tower of London. He was murdered there in 1471, probably on Edward IV's orders, ending the tragic life of a man who should never have been king. Henry VI's life demonstrates the cruelty of the system that created child kings. Henry wasn't stupid or deliberately bad. He was a gentle, pious man thrust into a role he was temperamentally and practically unsuited for. And that unsuitability was created by the very circumstances of his childhood kingship. If Henry had been born the son of a minor noble, he might have lived a happy life as a scholar or priest. But because he was born to the throne, because he inherited as an infant, because he grew up as a symbol rather than a person, he became one of England's worst kings and died violently in prison. The men who controlled his childhood, Gloucester, Beaufort, Bedford, and others, genuinely believed they were serving the kingdom, but they were also serving themselves. And in their conflicts over controlling the infant and child king, they created a situation where Henry could never develop into an effective ruler.
The regency system, designed to protect kingdoms when kings were too young to rule, instead became a period where adult conflicts were fought out around and through a child who had no real say in his own governance. Henry VI was used as a symbol, as a prize, as a source of legitimacy for others' ambitions, from infancy onward. His tragic end, deposed, imprisoned, murdered, was the culmination of a childhood where he was never allowed to be a child, only a crown attached to a small body. The infant king of two kingdoms grew up to be a man who couldn't hold on to one, destroyed by the very system that had placed him on the throne. From England, we turn to France and a very different child king, Louis IX, who became king at 12 and was controlled by his mother for decades, ultimately becoming one of France's greatest and most beloved kings, but at what personal cost? Louis was born on April 25, 1214, the son of King Louis VIII of France and Blanche of Castile. Unlike Henry VI, Louis had a living father for his first 12 years, so his childhood began relatively normally for a prince. But in November 1226, Louis VIII died suddenly, possibly of dysentery, while on campaign. His eldest son, Louis, was 12 years old enough to understand what kingship meant, but far too young to actually rule a medieval kingdom. Louis was crowned at Reims Cathedral on November 29, 1226, just weeks after his father's death. But everyone understood that the real ruler of France would be his mother, Blanche of Castile, serving as regent.
Blanche was one of the most remarkable women in medieval history. Born a Spanish princess, daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile, she had married into the French royal family and now found herself as regent for a child king. Medieval France was not kind to female regents. Many nobles believed women couldn't rule, that a regency under a foreign-born queen mother was intolerable. Blanche faced immediate challenges to her authority. But Blanche was formidable. She was intelligent, politically astute, decisive, and utterly committed to preserving the French crown for her son. She would rule France as regent for 15 years and continue to influence her son's decisions long after he reached his majority. Almost immediately, French nobles rebelled. They saw a 12-year-old king and a foreign woman regent as weakness, an opportunity to increase their own power and independence. The rebellions were led by powerful nobles, including Philip Hurrepel, Louis VIII's uncle, Peter Mauclerc, Duke of Brittany, and others. They claimed to be protecting the young king from his mother's foreign influence. Actually, they wanted to dominate the young king themselves. Blanche responded with remarkable skill. She built alliances with loyal nobles and offered concessions where necessary, used Louis as a symbol, bringing him to military camps to inspire loyalty to the crown, negotiated when she could, fought when she had to, played competing noble factions against each other, secured support from the church, which saw her regency as legitimate. She also made sure young Louis was seen and presented effectively. At 12, 13, 14, Louis was appearing in ceremonies, holding courts, and being presented as the legitimate king, even though everyone knew his mother made the real decisions. Blanche's relationship with Louis was complex. She clearly loved her son genuinely, but she also controlled him absolutely, and it's hard to separate maternal affection from political domination. Blanche supervised Louis's education intensely. He was taught Latin so he could read scripture and legal texts. Theology, Blanche emphasized piety and the king's religious duties. Justice, she modeled for him how to hear petitions and dispense royal justice. Kingship, but always filtered through her understanding and under her direction. Contemporary accounts describe Blanche as devoted but controlling. She chose Louis's companions, supervised his daily schedule, and famously didn't want him to be alone with his wife. Which brings us to Louis's marriage, a perfect example of how Blanche controlled her son. When Louis was 19, Blanche arranged his marriage to Marguerite of Provence, age 13. This marriage was politically advantageous, but Blanche had no intention of letting a young wife weaken her control over her son. Contemporary chronicles describe Blanche's jealousy of Marguerite. The famous writer Joinville reported that Blanche would interrupt Louis and Marguerite whenever she found them together, to the point where they had to sneak around their own palace to have private time as husband and wife. One story tells of servants posting lookouts to warn Louis when Blanche was approaching so he could return to his own chambers and not be found with his wife. The King of France, in his 20s, had to sneak around like a teenager to spend time with his own wife because his mother disapproved. Blanche reportedly told Louis that any time spent with his wife was time stolen from his kingly duties, which she defined and controlled. She created an atmosphere where Louis felt guilty for normal marital affection. This extreme control continued well past Louis's majority, age 21. Even after he was legally able to rule alone, Blanche continued to dominate policy decisions, appointments, and daily governance. She was the real ruler of France from 1226 to 1234 officially as regent, and substantially until her death in 1252. Why did Louis accept this? Several factors. Genuine love and respect. Louis loved his mother deeply. He genuinely admired her strength, intelligence, and devotion to France. This wasn't just manipulation. Their bond was real. Religious duty. Louis was intensely pious, eventually canonized as Saint Louis. He believed honoring his mother was a religious obligation. Blanche reinforced this, framing obedience to her as both filial piety and service to God. Successful model. Blanche's regency had been successful. She'd preserved the kingdom through rebellions and crises. Louis could see that her way worked, which made him trust her judgment. Lack of alternative models. Louis had never seen kingship done differently. His father died when he was young. Blanche's way was the only way he knew. Personality. Louis was gentle, pious, and averse to conflict. Asserting himself against his formidable mother would have required a confrontational personality he didn't have. Blanche essentially programmed Louis to be a specific kind of king, deeply religious, devoted to justice, committed to crusading, seeing kingship as a sacred duty. This programming worked. Louis became exactly the king Blanche had shaped him to be.
After Blanche's death in 1252, Louis finally ruled entirely on his own. He was 38 years old. He'd been king for 26 years, but only now was truly independent. Louis became famous for justice. He would sit under an oak tree at Vincennes, allowing any subject to approach with petitions. He genuinely tried to rule justly and fairly. Piety. He attended Mass daily, owned a piece of the True Cross, for which he built Sainte-Chapelle, practiced extreme religious devotion. Crusading. He went on 2 crusades, 1248 to 1254 and 1270, seeing it as his religious duty despite military failure. Legal reform. He established more consistent royal justice, limited private warfare, and strengthened royal authority. Personal asceticism. He lived simply, gave to the poor, and modeled Christian kingship. Louis became beloved in France and was canonized just 27 years after his death, the shortest period between death and canonization of any medieval monarch. He's remembered as France's greatest medieval king. But what did this cost Louis personally? We can only speculate, but there are hints. Delayed autonomy. Louis didn't really govern independently until middle age. What might he have done differently if he'd learned to rule earlier? Martial problems. His early relationship with Marguerite was complicated by Blanche's interference. They eventually had 11 children and seemed to have developed genuine affection, but the early years were strained. Crusade obsession. Louis's determination to crusade, despite its impracticality and the disaster of his first attempt, may have been partly about finally doing something purely his own choice, without his mother's guidance. Relationship patterns. Louis replicated with his own sons some of Blanche's control. He was devoted but domineering, seeing them as extensions of his will rather than independent people. Sainthood as cage. The saintly persona Louis developed was partly genuine, but it was also the persona Blanche had shaped him to adopt. How much was authentic Louis, and how much was programmed response? The paradox of Louis IX. Louis IX presents a paradox, a child king who was dominated and controlled by his mother, yet became one of France's greatest kings. Does this prove that Blanche's control was justified? That sometimes child kings need strong handlers? Or does it show the loss of potential, what Louis might have been if he developed more independently? Would he have been even greater, or would he have been just another mediocre king without Blanche's programming? We can't know. What we do know is that Louis spent his entire life under his mother's influence, first as a dominated child and teenager, then as an adult who had internalized her values so completely that he continued following her blueprint even after she died. Blanche's regency became a model for how powerful queen mothers could rule through their sons. She showed that a capable woman could preserve a kingdom during a child king's minority and shape that child into an effective adult ruler. But she also showed the dark side, the complete control, the denial of the child's autonomy well past reasonable age, the shaping of a human being into an instrument of policy rather than a complete person. Louis IX was used by his mother, benevolently, lovingly, with genuine concern for his welfare and Francis, but used nonetheless. She created a saint king, but in doing so, she prevented him from being fully his own person until middle age. The question remains, was this exploitation or excellent parenting, political manipulation or devoted motherhood, the use of a child king or the preservation of a kingdom through the best means available? Perhaps it was all of these things simultaneously, which makes Louis IX and Blanche of Castile one of the most complex and instructive cases of a child king and the powerful figure who controlled him.
Now we turn to a darker story. Richard II of England, who became king at 10, was manipulated by advisors throughout his reign, developed a dangerous combination of insecurity and grandiosity, and was ultimately deposed by his own cousin in a coup that ended his life and the Plantagenet main line. Richard was born in 1367, son of Edward the Black Prince. His father died in 1376, and his grandfather Edward III died in 1377, making 10-year-old Richard king. Richard's first great crisis came in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, a massive uprising of common people, angry about taxes and social restrictions, marched on London. The rebels killed nobles, burned buildings, and demanded reforms. The teenage Richard, 14 years old, rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield. When the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, was killed by one of Richard's men during the meeting, the situation could have exploded. But Richard, showing remarkable courage or perhaps not understanding the danger, rode directly toward the armed mob and convinced them to disperse peacefully. This moment has been interpreted various ways. Richard showing brave leadership, or Richard being manipulated by his advisors into a risky propaganda move, or Richard simply not understanding the danger due to youth and inexperience. Whatever the truth, it established a pattern. Young Richard being thrust into adult situations he couldn't fully comprehend, taking actions that seemed brave but whose consequences he didn't fully understand. Like all child kings, Richard became the center of power struggles. The key figures were John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Richard's uncle, immensely powerful and wealthy, who dominated the Regency Council. Gaunt genuinely tried to preserve the kingdom for Richard, but he also pursued his own interests, including a claim to the throne of Castile.
Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, another uncle, more aggressive and hostile to Richard. He would eventually lead opposition to Richard's adult rule. The Lords Appellant, a group of nobles, including Gloucester, who claimed Richard was being badly advised and demanded control of his government. Richard's favorites. As Richard grew older, he surrounded himself with friends and favorites, Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, others, who were resented by the established nobility. The pattern was familiar, powerful nobles claiming to act for the young king's benefit while actually pursuing their own agendas. But with Richard, there was a twist. As he matured, he actively chose sides and developed his own agenda, setting up conflicts with those who'd controlled him as a child. Growing up as a child king shaped Richard in specific ways: insecurity and grandiosity. Richard never felt secure. He'd been controlled as a child, challenged as a teenager, and faced rebellion as a young man. He compensated by developing an exalted view of kingship, insisting on elaborate ceremony, demanding complete obedience, seeing any criticism as treason. Suspicion of advisors. Having been manipulated by various factions, Richard became suspicious of everyone. He trusted favorites who told him what he wanted to hear, while distrusting capable advisors who offered unwelcome truths. Vindictiveness. Richard remembered slights and betrayals from his childhood and young adulthood. When he finally gained real power, he took revenge on those who'd opposed him, even decades later. Poor political judgment. Richard never learned to distinguish between wise counsel and flattery, between necessary compromise and weakness. His childhood of being controlled or manipulated didn't teach him healthy political skills. Artistic sophistication. Interestingly, Richard developed exquisite artistic taste. He patronized literature, he commissioned works from Chaucer, architecture, and visual arts. His court was culturally brilliant, but politically disastrous. In 1388, when Richard was 21, the Lords Appellant, including his uncle Gloucester, forced Richard to purge his favorites in what became known as the Merciless Parliament. Richard's close friend Robert de Vere fled into exile. Other favorites were executed. Richard submitted to this humiliation, but he never forgave it. For the next 9 years, he bided his time, pretending to cooperate with the appellants while actually planning revenge. In 1397, Richard struck. He arrested Gloucester and other appellants. Gloucester died in custody, probably murdered by Richard's orders. Others were executed or exiled. Richard purged the government of anyone who'd opposed him. This revenge, delayed for 9 years, showed both Richard's patience and his inability to move past childhood traumas. He couldn't let go of being controlled and humiliated as a young king, and his revenge destroyed what remained of his political support. The tyranny and deposition. From 1397 to 99, Richard ruled as increasingly tyrannical. He demanded absolute obedience, seeing any disagreement as treason, collected forced loans from nobles, exiled or executed those he suspected of disloyalty, created an atmosphere of fear where no one dared oppose him. He developed elaborate rituals of kingship that elevated him far above even the greatest nobles. The final crisis came in 1399. Richard exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, and then, when Gaunt died, confiscated Bolingbroke's inheritance. This was a fatal mistake. Nobles who had tolerated Richard's tyranny suddenly realized no one's property was safe. When Richard went to Ireland to deal with rebellion, Bolingbroke invaded England, claiming he only wanted his inheritance back. Richard returned from Ireland to find his support had collapsed. Nobles abandoned him. Bolingbroke captured him without real resistance. Richard was forced to abdicate, and Bolingbroke became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned at Pontefract Castle, where he died in early 1400, probably murdered, though officially he died of voluntary starvation. He was 33 years old.
Richard II's tragedy was rooted in his childhood kingship. If he'd inherited the throne as an adult, if he'd learned to rule gradually under an established king, if he'd developed political skills in a safe environment, he might have been a very different king. But he inherited at 10. He spent his formative years being controlled, manipulated, and pulled between factions.
He never developed healthy relationships with advisors or nobles because his childhood experiences taught him that advisors were manipulators and nobles were threats. His insecurity and grandiosity, his artistic brilliance and political ineptitude, his vindictiveness and his inability to forgive, all of these were shaped by a childhood where he was nominally the most powerful person in the kingdom, but actually powerless, where he was used by various factions and never learned to distinguish genuine service from self-serving manipulation. Richard was manipulated throughout his childhood, and that manipulation shaped him into a king who couldn't rule effectively, who saw threats everywhere, who couldn't build the relationships necessary to maintain power. His deposition was the culmination of a childhood that prepared him to be a symbol, but not a ruler, a crowned puppet who never learned to pull his own strings. Richard II's deposition had lasting consequences. It established that an anointed king could be forcibly removed for ruling badly. This precedent would haunt English monarchy for centuries. But more specifically for our purposes, it showed the danger of child kings developing in environments where they're controlled and manipulated. Richard's childhood created Richard the Tyrant, whose tyranny led to his overthrow and death. He joins Henry VI as an English child king whose childhood kingship directly contributed to their failures and tragic ends. The pattern was clear. Putting children on thrones and surrounding them with power-hungry adults created damaged kings who couldn't rule effectively. Yet the system continued because hereditary monarchy valued bloodline over competence, and chance meant children would regularly inherit. The tragedy of Richard II was that it was predictable. Childhood kingship regularly produced adults unsuited to rule, but the system couldn't or wouldn't change. Moving forward in time to Tudor England, we meet Edward VI, who inherited his father Henry VIII's throne at 9 years old and became a pawn in deadly religious conflicts that likely contributed to his death at 15. Edward was born on October 12, 1537, to Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. He was Henry's only legitimate son after Henry had declared his daughters Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate at various times. His birth was celebrated across England, finally a male heir to secure the Tudor succession. But his mother died 12 days after childbirth, probably from complications. Edward grew up without a mother, raised by a series of governesses and tutors chosen by his father. Henry VIII was a dominating presence in Edward's childhood. Henry was determined that Edward would be a perfect Renaissance prince, educated, pious, capable of ruling the vast power Henry had accumulated. Edward's education was rigorous: Latin, Greek, French, scripture, theology, philosophy, and practical statecraft. But Henry was also increasingly ill, paranoid, and tyrannical during Edward's childhood. Edward watched his father execute 2 wives, divorce another, and terrorize the court. This was the model of kingship Edward absorbed: absolute power, brutal to enemies, no compromise. When Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, 9-year-old Edward VI became King Edward VI of England. The Seymour coup. Henry VIII's will established a regency council of 16 men who were supposed to govern collectively until Edward came of age. But within days of Henry's death, this arrangement collapsed. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, Edward's uncle through his late mother, staged a coup. He had himself named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, giving him near absolute power. The other council members either submitted or were sidelined. Somerset justified this by claiming he was protecting his nephew. In reality, he was seizing power. Young Edward was moved between palaces, his daily life controlled by Somerset, who made all real decisions while occasionally consulting the child king on minor matters. Somerset pursued aggressive Protestant reforms. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, but maintained many Catholic practices. Somerset, using Edward's name and authority, pushed England decisively towards Protestantism. This was possible because Edward himself was genuinely Protestant. His tutors, chosen by Somerset and like-minded reformers, had raised him as a committed Protestant. At 9, 10, 11 years old, Edward was already writing essays on theology, arguing against Catholic doctrines, seeing himself as a crusader for Protestant truth. But how much was Edward's genuine belief, and how much was programming by adults who controlled his education? Can a child truly consent to being the figurehead of a religious revolution? These questions are unanswerable, but troubling.
Somerset's rule was increasingly unpopular. His religious reforms alienated Catholics. His military campaigns against Scotland were expensive failures. His economic policies created unrest. By 1549, rebellions erupted across England. Somerset's response was indecisive and ineffective. The Regency Council lost confidence in him. In October 1549, Somerset was overthrown in a coup led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland. Where was Edward during this coup? The 12-year-old king was essentially kidnapped by Somerset, who took him to Windsor Castle as rebellions and coups swirled. But Northumberland convinced the council that Edward needed to be rescued from Somerset's control. Edward was brought to London, and Somerset was imprisoned, later executed in 1552 on questionable charges of treason. Northumberland became the power behind the throne, taking the title Duke of Northumberland and creating a regime even more controlling than Somerset's. Northumberland was more sophisticated than Somerset in managing the young king. Rather than simply issuing orders in Edward's name, Northumberland involved Edward in governance, gave him the illusion of decision-making, and flattered his intelligence and piety. But it was still manipulation. Northumberland carefully controlled what information reached Edward, which advisors he saw, what options were presented to him. Edward thought he was making decisions, but Northumberland was shaping those decisions by controlling the context. Northumberland also pushed even more aggressive Protestant reforms, knowing Edward would support them enthusiastically. He used Edward's genuine religious fervor to legitimate policies that benefited Northumberland politically. By 1552 to 1553, as Edward entered his teenage years, he was more involved in governance but still ultimately controlled by Northumberland, who had eliminated rival councillors and created a government where everyone depended on him. In early 1553, it became clear that Edward was seriously ill. Modern analysis of symptoms suggests he probably had tuberculosis, though other diseases have been proposed. As Edward weakened, Northumberland faced a crisis. Henry VIII's will specified that if Edward died without heirs, the throne would pass to Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, then Elizabeth. Mary was fervently Catholic. If she became queen, Northumberland would likely be executed, and all the Protestant reforms would be reversed. Northumberland needed to change the succession, but he couldn't do it alone. It required the king's authority. So he manipulated the dying Edward. Edward, genuinely terrified of Catholic restoration, was convinced to write a device for the succession that excluded Mary and Elizabeth and instead left the throne to Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law, a Protestant and someone Northumberland could control. Historians still debate how much of this was Edward's own decision versus Northumberland's manipulation of a sick, dying boy. The evidence suggests a mix. Edward genuinely wanted to prevent Catholic restoration, but Northumberland shaped Edward's options, pressured him, and exploited his illness and fear. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. His final months had been agonizing, coughing, wasting away, in constant pain. Contemporary accounts describe his final days: delirious, barely able to speak, his body covered in sores, his breath failing. This child, who had inherited the throne at 9 and known nothing but being controlled and used by powerful men, died young and suffering.
There have been persistent theories that Edward was poisoned, that Northumberland, desperate to control the succession, hastened Edward's death to put Jane Grey on the throne before Mary could act. The evidence is ambiguous. Edward was certainly sick with a natural illness, but did Northumberland's doctors give him substances that hastened death rather than curing him? We'll probably never know for certain. Northumberland's plot failed. Jane Grey reigned for 9 days before Mary rallied supporters and took the throne. Northumberland was executed. Jane Grey, an unwilling pawn in Northumberland's scheme, was imprisoned and later executed at age 16, another victim of the deadly games played around child monarchs. Edward VI never had a chance to develop naturally. From birth, he was the long-awaited heir, the prize, the future of England. From age 9, he was king, but a king controlled first by Somerset, then by Northumberland, both of whom used him for their own ends while claiming to serve him. Edward's genuine Protestant fervor was encouraged and exploited. His intelligence was praised while being directed toward predetermined conclusions. His authority was invoked constantly while real decisions were made by others. He died at 15, having been king for 6 years but never truly in control of his own government or his own life. He was used as a tool for Protestant reform, as a legitimizer for coups and political purges, and possibly even his death was hastened because he was more useful dead, allowing succession manipulation, than alive, likely to reach majority and take real power soon. Edward VI's short life shows the particular danger of child kings in periods of religious or ideological conflict. Adults could project their beliefs onto the child, claim his authority for their causes, and exploit his genuine convictions, which they'd often helped form, to advance their own agendas. The child king became not just a political pawn, but an ideological weapon, wielded by Protestant reformers against Catholics, by one faction against another, by men who convinced themselves they were serving God and England while actually serving their own power. Edward VI deserved better. He deserved a childhood. He deserved the chance to develop his own beliefs rather than being programmed with them. He deserved to learn to rule gradually, with experienced guidance rather than manipulation. He deserved to live past 15. Instead, he became one more tragic example of what happened when kingdoms placed crowns on children's heads and powerful men fought to control them. The child king didn't survive to adulthood, destroyed by the very system that made him king. Now we travel to Russia for perhaps the darkest story of a child king, Ivan IV, who became Grand Prince of Moscow at 3 years old, suffered through a childhood of neglect, manipulation, and violence, and grew up to become Ivan the Terrible, one of history's most brutal rulers. Ivan was born on August 25, 1530, the long-awaited son of Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow. His birth secured the succession of the still new Russian state, but Ivan's childhood would be catastrophic. When Ivan was 3 years old in 1533, his father Vasily died. Ivan became Grand Prince, with his mother Elena Glinskaya as regent. For 5 years, Elena ruled effectively, protecting her son and managing the Russian state competently. But in 1538, when Ivan was 8, Elena died suddenly, probably poisoned by rival boyar families who wanted to seize control of the regency. With Elena's death, Ivan's real nightmare began. For the next 8 years, from age 8 to 16, Ivan lived through what can only be described as a childhood of terror and neglect at the hands of competing boyar families. With no effective regent, Russian government fell into chaos as boyar families, powerful noble families, fought for control. The Shuisky family and the Belsky family were the main rivals, but others competed too. These families treated young Ivan with shocking cruelty and neglect. Physical neglect. Contemporary accounts describe Ivan and his brother as being left hungry, dressed in rags, forced to beg for food from servants. The Grand Prince of Moscow, supposedly the most powerful person in Russia, was literally going hungry in his own palace. Psychological terror. The boyars would burst into Ivan's rooms at any hour, ignore his presence, conduct their business while treating him as irrelevant. They killed people in front of him, arrested and executed his mother's supporters while he watched, demonstrated that his title meant nothing and they had the real power. Deliberate humiliation. The boyars seemed to take pleasure in humiliating the young Grand Prince, reminding him that he was powerless, that his title was worthless, that they could do whatever they wanted to him. Violence and instability. Coups and counter-coups meant Ivan never knew who was in charge, which boyars were dominant, or whether he was personally safe. People who'd been kind to him one day were executed the next. Nothing was stable or safe. Education through terror. The only consistent element of Ivan's childhood education was learning that power meant the ability to hurt others, that mercy was weakness, that trust was deadly, and that the way to survive was through violence and fear. Ivan later wrote about his childhood in letters, describing the hunger, fear, and humiliation he never forgot. And, more importantly, he learned specific lessons from this childhood, that power was the only security, that enemies must be destroyed completely, that mercy leads to exploitation, and that inspiring terror is the only way to maintain control.
As Ivan grew older, he began to show disturbing behaviors that would have concerned child psychologists, but that his contemporaries saw as a prince learning to assert himself. Around age 13-14, Ivan began torturing animals, throwing dogs from walls, burning them alive, dissecting them while still living. This classic warning sign of future violence was ignored or even encouraged by some as showing princely spirit. Ivan also began ordering executions. At age 13, he had the boyar Andrei Shweisky, who'd been particularly cruel to him, arrested and thrown to his hunting dogs to be torn apart. At age 14-15, he was ordering other executions, testing his power. The boyars who had treated him so badly suddenly realized they'd created something dangerous, but by then it was too late. On January 16, 1547, at age 16, Ivan was crowned Tsar, or emperor, in an elaborate ceremony that elevated his title above previous grand princes. This was Ivan's attempt to assert that his childhood powerlessness was over, that he would rule absolutely. Shortly after, he married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman from a relatively minor boyar family. Anastasia seems to have been a genuinely good influence, kind, stabilizing, perhaps the only person Ivan truly trusted and loved. For the next 13 years, 1547 to 1560, with Anastasia's influence and guided by capable advisors, the chosen council, Ivan ruled relatively well. He reformed law, created the first Russian law code, Sudebnik of 1550, reformed the military, expanded Russian territory, and generally seemed to be becoming a capable ruler. This period shows what Ivan might have become with a normal childhood and continued positive influences. He had intelligence, energy, and capability, but the demons from his childhood were always there, waiting. In 1560, Anastasia died, probably from illness. Ivan was devastated. He became convinced she'd been poisoned by boyars. There's no evidence of this, but given his childhood experiences, his paranoia was understandable. Anastasia's death broke whatever psychological stability Ivan had achieved. The careful, relatively effective ruler began to disappear. The terrorized, traumatized child who had learned that power meant violence and enemies must be destroyed began to emerge. In 1565, Ivan established the Oprichnina, a state within the state, a territory directly controlled by Ivan through a private army, the Oprichniki, who wore black, rode black horses, and carried symbols of dogs' heads and brooms to represent sniffing out treason and sweeping it away. The Oprichnina was essentially Ivan's childhood trauma institutionalized as state policy. It was designed to eliminate any threat to his power, real or imagined, inspire terror so complete that no one would dare oppose him, allow Ivan to punish anyone who reminded him of his boyar tormentors, and create a group personally loyal to him alone, outside traditional structures. The Oprichniki carried out mass executions, tortures, and property confiscations. Entire cities suspected of disloyalty were depopulated. Novgorod, Russia's second-largest city, was brutally sacked in 1570, with thousands killed and the city's wealth plundered. Ivan personally participated in tortures and executions, seeming to take pleasure in others' suffering, the same pleasure the boyars had taken in his suffering as a child, now reversed. In 1581, Ivan, in a fit of rage, struck his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, with his pointed staff. The blow was fatal. The Tsarevich died days later. Ivan was reportedly devastated, realizing he'd killed his own heir and the future of his dynasty. But the murder showed how completely his childhood trauma had warped him. In moments of rage, violence was his automatic response, even against his own beloved son.
Ivan died in 1584 at age 53. His legacy was a Russia traumatized by decades of terror, a weakened state, and a succession crisis. His heir was his unfit second son, Fyodor, who left no heirs, leading to the time of troubles. But Ivan's deeper legacy is as a case study in how childhood trauma and abuse create monsters. Ivan wasn't born terrible, he was made terrible by his childhood. Ivan the Terrible is the most extreme example of how child kingship could go catastrophically wrong. If the mechanisms for controlling child kings failed, as they did when Elena died and the boyars fought among themselves, the child king became not just powerless, but actively victimized. Ivan's childhood taught him, power is the only security. Trust is deadly. Violence is how to control others. Mercy is weakness that invites exploitation. Everyone is a potential threat. These lessons, learned between ages 8 and 16, shaped the next 30 years of his rule. The terrorized child became the terrifying adult, inflicting on Russia what had been inflicted on him. Modern psychology would recognize Ivan as suffering from severe PTSD, probably personality disorders, definitely the effects of severe childhood trauma and abuse. But in his own time, he was just a czar who happened to be cruel, and the connection between his childhood and his adult tyranny wasn't made. Ivan's case is extreme, but it illustrates a general problem. Child kings were vulnerable in ways adult kings weren't. If systems for protecting and guiding them worked, they might turn out okay, like Louis IX. But if those systems failed, or if the child was actively abused, like Ivan, the results could be catastrophic, not just for the child, but for entire kingdoms. The men who controlled Ivan's childhood, the boyars who neglected and abused him, created Ivan the Terrible as surely as if they deliberately programmed him to become a monster. Their short-sighted fighting over power, their cruel treatment of a child they considered irrelevant, their failure to recognize they were creating someone who would remember and take revenge, all of this led to decades of terror. Ivan the Terrible shows us the darkest possible outcome of child kingship, a damaged child growing into a damaged adult with absolute power, inflicting his trauma on an entire nation. He is what happens when the system for protecting child kings completely fails, and the child learns the wrong lessons from those who control him. We've now met 5 child kings, each with different outcomes. Let's step back and examine the patterns. How did the system of regency actually work? How did men control child kings? And why did this system persist despite its obvious problems? Medieval monarchy had a fundamental problem. It was hereditary, based on bloodline and divine right, which meant the next heir was determined by biology and succession law, not competence or age. This meant that sometimes, regularly, unavoidably, the heir was a child, and a child cannot perform the functions of kingship, leading armies, making complex political decisions, managing noble factions, dispensing justice, conducting diplomacy. But the system couldn't simply skip over child heirs. The entire legitimacy of monarchy rested on the principle that the rightful heir, designated by blood and God, must inherit. To pass over a child heir for an adult relative would undermine the whole system. So, kingdoms developed regency systems to manage the contradiction. The child was king in title and legitimacy, but others would govern in his name until he came of age. Regency structures. Regencies took different forms. Single regent, usually a close relative, mother, uncle, appointed as regent with near absolute authority. Example, Blanche of Castile for Louis IX. Regency Council, a group of nobles and clergy who would govern collectively. Example, the council initially planned for Edward VI, though it quickly collapsed into Somerset's personal rule. Protector, an individual with limited powers, technically managing the child rather than ruling directly. Example, Richard, Duke of Gloucester as protector for Edward V, before seizing the throne as Richard III. The form varied by kingdom, customs, and circumstances, but all forms shared a basic problem. The regents had incentives to maintain and extend their power, which meant either manipulating the child king or preventing him from taking real control, even after coming of age.
When did a child king become an adult king? There was no consistent answer. Canon law said 12 for girls, 14 for boys, for marriage consent. Roman law traditions suggested different ages. Different kingdoms had different customs, and political convenience often determined when a king was declared of age. Henry VI was declared of age at 16, but remained dominated by advisors. Richard II was declared of age at various points, depending on who was claiming authority. Louis IX was technically of age at 21, but remained under his mother's control much longer. The ambiguity allowed regents to extend control. The king is technically of age, but still needs our guidance and wisdom to rule effectively. This justification could continue indefinitely if the king was compliant or weak. How did regents and advisors actually control child kings? Several methods. Physical control, controlling who the child saw, where he lived, his daily schedule. Example, Edward VI moved between palaces by Somerset and Northumberland, his interactions carefully managed. Information control, controlling what information reached the child, which advisors he heard, what options were presented. Example, Northumberland ensuring Edward VI only heard arguments for changing the succession to Jane Grey. Education and programming, shaping the child's beliefs, values, and understanding of kingship through careful selection of tutors and curriculum. Example, Blanche of Castile's control of Louis IX's education. Emotional manipulation, using love, guilt, religious duty, or fear to control the child's decisions. Example, Blanche making Louis feel guilty for time spent with his wife rather than kingly duties. Isolation, keeping the child away from alternative influences or information sources. Example, Ivan's isolation being used by boyars, though in his case through neglect rather than deliberate control. Ceremony and symbol, using the child as a symbol in ceremonies while ensuring he had no real power. Example, young Henry VI being brought to military camps to inspire troops, but making no actual military decisions. Gradual inclusion. As the child aged, including him in governance in controlled ways that gave the illusion of power while maintaining actual control. Example, Northumberland involving Edward VI in council meetings while controlling the agenda and information. How did regents and advisors justify controlling children? Several arguments. Inexperience. The king is too young to understand these complex matters. We must guide him until he gains the wisdom and experience necessary to rule. Protection. We are protecting the king from bad influences, manipulation by his enemies, and decisions he'll regret when older. Service to the kingdom. Our duty is to the kingdom, not just to the king. We must ensure good governance, which means making decisions the king would make if he were able. Preserving options. We don't want the young king to make irreversible mistakes. We're preserving his full authority for when he's mature enough to use it wisely. Divine trust. God has placed us in this position of responsibility. We must answer to him for how we guide the young king. Some of these justifications were sincere. Some regents genuinely believed they were serving the king and kingdom. Others were self-serving rationalizations. Most were probably a mix. The competition for control. Because controlling the child king meant effectively ruling the kingdom, regents faced competition. Family members, uncles, cousins, mothers, all might claim the right to guide the child king, leading to conflicts like Gloucester versus Beaufort in Henry VI's childhood. Established nobility. Great nobles who weren't closely related to the king but held traditional positions of power and influence. New favorites. As the child grew, his own preferences might elevate new people, creating conflicts with established regents. Foreign powers. Other kingdoms might try to influence the regency for their own diplomatic advantage. These competitions could be peaceful political maneuvering or could explode into civil war, as with the Wars of the Roses. The child king was the prize, and whoever controlled him controlled the kingdom.
The most dangerous moment in a child king's reign was the transition from childhood to adult rule. This is when regents were supposed to cede power but often didn't want to. The child king began asserting his own will, often clumsily. Competing factions fought for the maturing king's favor. Mistakes in this transition could lead to coups, civil wars, or the king's deposition. Richard II's transition involved the merciless parliament humiliating him, creating resentment that eventually led to his tyranny and deposition. Henry VI's transition was so gradual and controlled that he never really gained effective power. Edward VI didn't survive to transition. Ivan's transition was violent and vindictive. Successful transitions, like Louis IX's, though prolonged and controlled, required careful management, a compliant king, or a regent willing to cede power gradually. Why the system persisted? Given all these problems, why did medieval Europe continue putting children on thrones? Several reasons. Ideological commitment. The principle of hereditary succession was fundamental to monarchy's legitimacy. Changing it would undermine the entire system. Lack of alternatives. Other succession systems, election, appointment, had their own problems and seemed to medieval minds even worse than occasional child kings. Sometimes it worked. Louis IX became a great king despite, or because of, his controlled childhood. Other child kings grew up to rule effectively. The system's failures were dramatic but not universal. Individual solutions. Each kingdom could convince itself that its particular regency arrangements would prevent problems even if other kingdoms hadn't. Benefits for elites. Child kings meant periods when power devolved to nobility and councils, which those groups liked. They had little incentive to change a system that periodically gave them power. Religious fatalism. Many believed that who became king was God's will. If God chose to give a kingdom a child king, that was part of divine plan, not something to be fixed by human institutions. The invisible victims. One group whose interests were rarely considered, the children themselves. Medieval thinking didn't sentimentalize childhood the way modern cultures do. Children were seen as incomplete adults, not as people with their own needs and rights. A child king was a king who happened to be young, not a child who needed childhood. The psychological damage to children who grew up as kings wasn't considered. The loss of normal childhood wasn't seen as a problem. The manipulation, control, and use of children for adult purposes wasn't questioned. Modern child psychology and development weren't available. No one understood trauma, attachment, developmental stages, or the long-term effects of childhood experiences on adult functioning. So the system continued, producing damaged adults like Ivan the Terrible, ineffective kings like Henry VI, and destroyed lives like Edward VI, with no recognition that the system itself was harming the children it placed on thrones. The pattern's persistence. The pattern of child kings and the men who controlled them continued throughout medieval and early modern European history. Even as late as Louis XIV, crowned at age 4, controlled by his mother and Cardinal Mazarin, the basic dynamic persisted. Only with the gradual shift away from absolute monarchy, the development of constitutional limits, and eventually the decline of monarchy itself, did the child-king problem diminish, not because people solved it, but because monarchy's role changed enough that having a child monarch mattered less. But for centuries, medieval Europe regularly sacrificed children on the altar of hereditary succession, placing impossible burdens on small shoulders, surrounding them with manipulative adults, and then judging the resulting damaged adults as failures without recognizing the system's role in creating those failures.
Beyond the politics and power struggles, behind the grand historical narratives, were children. Real children whose childhoods were stolen by the crowns placed on their heads. Let's take a moment to consider the human cost of child kingship. What normal childhood looks like. To understand what these child kings lost, we should consider what childhood normally provides. Safety and protection. Children need to feel physically and emotionally safe, protected by caring adults from threats and burdens beyond their capacity. Play and development. Children develop through play, exploration, and age-appropriate challenges. They need time to be children, not to carry adult responsibilities. Gradual responsibility. Children should take on responsibilities gradually, with support and the ability to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. Trust and attachment. Children need stable, trustworthy adult relationships to develop healthy attachment and the ability to trust others. Learning from mistakes. Children need to make mistakes and learn from them without those mistakes defining their identity or having permanent consequences. Privacy and autonomy. As children grow, they need increasing privacy and autonomy to develop independent identities. Child kings got virtually none of this. What child kings experienced instead? Constant danger. Every child king faced real physical danger, from illness, assassination plots, kidnapping attempts, coups. They couldn't feel safe because they weren't safe. Adult responsibilities. From infancy or early childhood, they carried the weight of kingdoms. Decisions made in their name affected millions. They were blamed for failures of governments they didn't control. No room for mistakes. Every action, every word was scrutinized. Mistakes weren't learning opportunities, but political crises. Child kings couldn't afford to be childish. Manipulative relationships. Every adult relationship was potentially about control and manipulation. Trust was dangerous. Even loving relationships, like Louis and Blanche, were complicated by power dynamics. Public life. Child kings had almost no privacy. Their meals, sleeping, playing, studying, all were observed, reported, and judged. They couldn't develop private selves separate from their public roles. Forced maturity. They had to seem mature beyond their years. Showing typical childhood emotions or behaviors was seen as weakness or failure. They learned to suppress normal childhood responses. The psychological impact. Modern child psychology helps us understand what these experiences did to developing minds. Attachment problems. Children who can't trust that adults have their best interests at heart develop insecure attachment. This affects all future relationships and can lead to anxiety, depression, and relationship problems. Identity issues. Children who are treated as symbols or tools rather than people struggle to develop authentic identities. They don't know who they are apart from their role. Learned helplessness. Children who have no control over their lives can develop learned helplessness, believing they cannot influence outcomes, leading to passivity or, conversely, aggressive over-control of whatever they can control. Trust issues. Children who are manipulated and lied to learn not to trust others' motives. This can become permanent paranoia or difficulty forming close relationships. Trauma. Children who experience violence, severe stress, or chronic fear develop trauma that affects their adult functioning. Ivan the Terrible is an extreme example, but lesser trauma affected all child kings. Emotional regulation problems. Children who must suppress emotions don't learn healthy emotional regulation. This can lead to emotional volatility in adulthood.
Child kingship also took physical tolls. Stress-related illness. Chronic stress affects children's physical health. Several child kings were sickly, possibly partly due to stress. Lack of physical activity. Child kings spent hours in councils, ceremonies, and studies. They had less opportunity for normal childhood physical activity. Early death. Multiple child kings died young. While medieval mortality was generally high, the stresses of kingship may have contributed to early deaths like Edward VI's. Sexual dysfunction. Several child kings struggled with sexuality and relationships in adulthood, possibly due to childhoods lacking normal development of these aspects. Let's revisit our child kings with this lens. Henry VI showed signs of what we'd now recognize as mental illness, his catatonic episodes, his inability to function, his gentle but ineffectual nature. His childhood created a man unsuited for the role thrust upon him. Louis IX became a saint, but at the cost of never developing independence from his mother until middle age. His extreme religiosity might have been partly a retreat from the political pressures and control of his childhood. Richard II developed a personality combining grandiosity and insecurity, vindictiveness and artistic sensitivity. His childhood experiences of being controlled and humiliated clearly shaped his adult tyranny. Edward VI died at 15, possibly hastened by stress and the machinations around him. We'll never know what kind of man he might have become because he didn't survive to adulthood. Ivan the Terrible, the most obvious victim, whose childhood trauma created a monster who terrorized Russia for decades. His extreme case shows what childhood abuse and neglect can create when combined with absolute power. Some damage was visible: mental breakdowns, tyrannical behavior, early death, but much damage was invisible. The child kings who never felt truly secure, even in adulthood. The relationships they couldn't form because trust had been destroyed. The private selves they never developed because their public role consumed everything. The normal experiences they never had and missed forever. The capacity for joy, play, and spontaneity that was crushed by premature adult responsibility. The adults surrounding child kings weren't villains, mostly. They were products of their time, pursuing what they saw as necessary and justified. Regents like Blanche of Castile genuinely loved their children while controlling them absolutely. Advisors like those around Edward VI genuinely believed in their religious cause while using a child as its instrument. Even the boyars who abused Ivan were pursuing what they saw as their rightful power in a time of weak central authority. But the system they operated within was inherently harmful to children. A system that placed crowns on children's heads, made children responsible for adult decisions, surrounded children with adults competing to control them, gave children no protection from manipulation and use, judged children by adult standards of effectiveness,
provided no recognition of children's developmental needs. This system was going to damage children regardless of whether individual adults were well-intentioned or malicious. We should note that this problem was specifically about boys, because medieval Europe rarely allowed girls to inherit thrones in their own right. When girls did inherit, like Mary I of England after Edward VI, they faced different problems: sexism, pressure to marry and cede power to husbands, doubts of female capacity to rule. But they generally weren't crowned as infants or toddlers, so they escaped the specific problems of child kingship we've been discussing. This meant the burden of child kingship fell exclusively on boys, adding a gendered dimension to the tragedy. Boys were seen as ready for kingship whenever biology made them heirs, regardless of actual readiness, while girls were often denied inheritance even as adults.
Could medieval Europe have protected child kings better? Possibly. Clearer rules about regency structure and duration, better institutional mechanisms to limit regents' power, recognition that child kings needed protection from political manipulation, systems that allowed child kings to have actual childhoods before taking power. But these would have required medieval people to value children's welfare in ways they generally didn't, and to rethink fundamental assumptions about hereditary monarchy. The tragedy is that the suffering of child kings was predictable and avoidable, but continued because the system valued bloodline succession above children's well-being, political stability above developmental needs, and maintained power structures over the welfare of the children trapped within them. We might feel superior to medieval people for placing such burdens on children, but modern societies still sometimes sacrifice children's welfare to institutional needs. Child performers exploited by entertainment industries, children of political figures forced into public roles, child athletes pushed beyond healthy limits. Any system that values children primarily for what they can provide rather than protecting their developmental needs. The child kings of medieval Europe are extreme examples, but the underlying problem, using children for adult purposes without adequate protection of their welfare, persists wherever children's rights and needs are subordinated to other concerns. The human cost of child kingship was paid by children who became pawns, symbols, tools, and prizes in adult power games. They paid with their childhoods, often with their mental health, sometimes with their lives. And the system kept producing new victims because it valued hereditary succession more than it valued the children whose lives it destroyed. We've journeyed through the lives of 5 child kings and the men who controlled them, witnessing the patterns that emerge when medieval Europe placed its greatest power on its smallest shoulders. Now, as we conclude, let's reflect on what these stories teach us about power, childhood, and the human cost of systems that prioritize institutions over individuals. Across different centuries, kingdoms, and circumstances, certain patterns recurred. Vulnerability. Every child king was vulnerable to manipulation and control. Their youth, inexperience, and dependency on adults made them easy to use as tools for others' ambitions. Competition. Every child king became the center of power struggles between adults competing to control him. This competition ranged from political maneuvering to civil war. Damage. Every child king was damaged by the experience, whether through psychological trauma, Ivan, Richard II, political ineffectiveness, Henry VI, premature death, Edward VII, or prolonged control, Louis IX. Justification. In every case, adults justified control of the child as necessary, beneficial, or inevitable, while pursuing their own interests. Systemic blindness. In every case, the system failed to recognize that it was harming children because the system valued bloodline succession more than children's welfare. These patterns weren't accidents or isolated incidents. They were inherent to a system of hereditary monarchy that couldn't accommodate the simple biological fact that heirs are sometimes children.
We've met various types of men who controlled child kings. The devoted but controlling. Blanche of Castile loved Louis IX genuinely, but controlled him absolutely into middle age. Her devotion and dominance were inseparable. The ambitious nobles. Gloucester, Beaufort, Somerset, Northumberland, men pursuing their own power while claiming to serve the king and kingdom. The abusive neglectors, the boyars who destroyed Ivan's childhood through cruelty and neglect, teaching him that power means violence. The well-meaning but destructive, many advisors and regents who genuinely believed they were helping while actually manipulating and limiting the child kings. Most fell somewhere on a spectrum between genuine service and naked exploitation. Many convinced themselves they were serving when they were actually self-serving. The psychology of those who controlled child kings was complex. Humans are excellent at rationalizing their actions as beneficial when they also benefit themselves. The question of alternative systems. Could medieval Europe have done things differently? Several alternatives existed or could have been imagined. Skipping child heirs, passing the throne to an adult relative, uncle, cousin, until the child reached majority. But this undermined hereditary succession's legitimacy. Stronger institutional constraints, creating regency systems with better checks on regents' power. But this was difficult in systems where the king's word was supposed to be absolute. Recognizing children's needs, protecting child kings from political manipulation and allowing them genuine childhoods. But this required valuing children's welfare in ways medieval culture generally didn't. Moving beyond hereditary monarchy, developing alternative systems like election or appointment based on competence, but this threatened the entire social order. Medieval Europe chose hereditary monarchy despite its problems because it seemed to provide stability and legitimacy. The periodic child king was seen as an acceptable price for the system's benefits. The children who paid that price weren't consulted. What they lost. The child kings of Europe lost childhoods, simple, irreplaceable childhoods that can never be recovered. Henry VI lost the chance to develop gradually, to learn kingship from an experienced king, to become the person he might have been. Louis IX lost autonomy and independence until middle age, shaped entirely by his mother's vision. Richard II lost trust and security, developing the paranoia and vindictiveness that destroyed him. Edward VI lost his life at 15, never reaching adulthood. Ivan lost safety, kindness, and basic humanity, becoming a monster in response to monstrous treatment. They lost the protection all children deserve. They lost the right to make mistakes without catastrophic consequences. They lost privacy, play, and the gradual assumption of responsibility that allows healthy development. They lost these things not because they were unlucky or because particular adults were villains, but because the system of hereditary monarchy valued bloodline succession above children's needs and had no mechanism to protect children from the burdens of kingship. The broader lessons. The child kings of Europe teach lessons beyond medieval history. About power, power separated from competence, age, or readiness is dangerous. Systems that grant power based solely on bloodline or other inherited characteristics, regardless of capability, create problems. About children, children are vulnerable and deserve protection. Systems that use children for adult purposes without protecting their welfare harm those children predictably and preventably. About institutions, institutions that can't adapt when they harm those within them are flawed. Medieval monarchy couldn't protect child kings because doing so would have required questioning fundamental assumptions. About justification. People are remarkably good at justifying harmful actions as necessary or beneficial. The men who controlled child kings convinced themselves they were serving the kingdom while actually pursuing power. About inherited burdens. Being born into privilege or power doesn't mean you escape suffering. Sometimes it means suffering of a particular kind that others don't experience.
Medieval chroniclers often wrote of the weight of the crown, the heavy burden of kingship. For adult kings, this was metaphorical. For child kings, it was devastatingly literal. A crown on a child's head crushes rather than elevates. Authority given to those too young to understand it doesn't empower, it overwhelms. Responsibility without capacity, power without readiness, expectations without preparation, these destroy rather than develop. The child kings of Europe bore crowns too heavy for their small shoulders, and most were crushed by the weight. Their stories are tragedies, but tragedies of a specific, preventable kind. Tragedies that resulted from a system that valued the institution of monarchy more than the children it placed at its apex. Gratitude and invitation. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey through the lives of child kings and the men who controlled them. These aren't easy stories, but they're important ones. Reminders of how systems can harm even those they seem to privilege, how childhood can be stolen by circumstance and power, and how adults' choices shape children's lives in ways both visible and hidden. If you found value in this exploration, please subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the human stories behind historical events. Share this with anyone who's interested in medieval history, childhood studies, or the darker side of power. And please leave a comment below telling me which aspect of medieval childhood or power dynamics you'd like us to explore next. Your engagement truly shapes our content and helps these important stories reach more people. Remember the child kings whose stories we've told. Henry VI, lost in a world he couldn't navigate. Louis IX, shaped into a saint but never his own person. Richard II, paranoid and vindictive from childhood trauma. Edward VI, dead at 15. Ivan the Terrible, monster made by monsters. Remember them not with pity or scorn, but with recognition of what the system did to them. They weren't weak or bad children who became failed kings. They were children placed in impossible situations, used by adults for adult purposes, and damaged by experiences no child should endure. The medieval world placed crowns on children's heads and called it divine right, but there was nothing divine about the suffering that followed, nothing sacred about childhood stolen, lives damaged, and potential destroyed. These were human tragedies created by human systems that valued power structures above the people trapped within them. May we remember the child kings of Europe and the lessons they teach, that children deserve protection regardless of their status, that systems that harm those within them need reform regardless of tradition, and that crowns too heavy for small shoulders should never be placed there, no matter what bloodline or divine right claims they must be. The men who used them claimed to serve kingdoms and kings, but the child kings themselves, the boys who bore impossible burdens, who lost childhoods to crowns they never asked for, who suffered and died for systems they didn't create, they were the ones truly serving, paying prices they never agreed to, sacrificing childhoods to maintain a system that ultimately failed to protect them. Until our next historical journey, may we remember that power without protection is cruelty, that authority without readiness is burden, and that the weight of crowns should never rest on heads too young to bear them. Good night, and may we learn from these tragic lessons how to better protect the vulnerable, even, especially, when they seem powerful.